Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you for having me. I don't usually, in this age of being politically correct, I'm a little afraid to start out this way, but I heard your song. I don't think the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is anything to worry about. So it's 37 years in the FAA. As a matter of fact, I reported for my first position in the FAA at the Cleveland Area Traffic Control Center in Oberlin, Ohio, 50 years ago this past October. So, and I was in the Air Force for controlling for 4 years prior to that. And I must say, I controlled my first airplane in 1964, and really the air traffic system in America hasn't changed since then. So whoever designed it, they were brilliant. So it still works today. Lots of other changes in it with regard to GPS systems and whatnot, things that pilots can do now that that controllers had to make sure they instructed them to do in days past. Makes the job a little bit easier by the fact that most of the airlines are using GPS to go direct from point to point. But I started my career, as I said, in Cleveland Center. I got out of the Air Force in '65, and the FAA wasn't hiring anybody back then, so I had to wait 2 years, and I worked at a job in Philadelphia for a couple of years, and the FAA finally began hiring people in 1967. My first assignment was the Cleveland Area Traffic Control Center. That was a huge room with about 300 or 400 people. Never saw an airplane unless I was driving back and forth to work. It was strictly a radar operation. I'll talk a little bit about the types of facilities that air traffic controllers work at in just a minute. But just to brief you on my career, after Cleveland, and my wife hated Cleveland the day before she got there, so she asked me if I could go to Philadelphia. So after being in Cleveland for 6 months, actually I started in the center shortly after I went to Cleveland Tower, which is in North Ohio. I'm not sure if anybody here knows Cleveland Airport, but great place to work. But I only lasted there about a year and a half because my wife wanted to go to Philadelphia. So I went to Philadelphia and asked the manager, a man named Leo Marshall, favorite guy of mine, and I said, gee, I'd like to come here. He said, well, we don't need anybody here. Why don't you go to New York? I said, gee, you really think they'll take me in New York? So he took out a mirror from his desk and he breathed on it. He said, can you do this? Can you clock this up? They'll take you. 6 weeks later, I was in New York. And they assigned me to the Kennedy sector. And so every time a new controller goes to a particular place, they have to learn everything about that facility. And really, it took me about a year and a half before I was totally certified to work all the positions by myself at Kennedy Approach Control. Again, this was a facility, this was an experiment. It opened in 1968 in a hangar at JFK Airport, where they took the controllers from Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark Tower, and they put them all in the same room. They left the people up in the tower cats to look out the window and say, clear to land and clear for takeoff, but all the radar controllers moved over to this room, this hangar, pretty big place, at JFK. And I worked there until 1978, February, when I came here. And soon after that, that room moved to Westbury, New York, roughly, anybody's familiar, just off of Old Country Road in Westbury, where they are today. And so what that experiment was to take the approach controllers from the 3 major airports, sit them side by side. This way, instead of having to call each other on the phone very often to coordinate airplanes moving to each other's airspace, they just kind of walked over to your scope and they pointed to somebody, say, hey, can I descend this guy? Can I climb this guy? And so the coordination was much easier. So at Kennedy, after about 9.5 years or so, I was on a recruiting trip to try to get people to come to New York. People just didn't want to come to New York. They're just intimidated. And so came all through this area, through Reading, through Allentown, through Harrisburg. And at Harrisburg, the manager of that place was an old friend of mine, said, why don't you come here and be one of my supervisors on it? And I hesitated, and because I did want to leave New York and get closer to Philadelphia, and I actually wanted to go to Philadelphia. And so I agreed to come to Harrisburg in 1978. We were over at Capital City at the time, at least the approach control was. And then eventually in 91 or so, we moved over to Harrisburg International. And so he convinced me to come here. So I was on a recruiting trip to get people to come to New York. I end up here. And immediately moved to Lancaster. Being from Philadelphia, wanted to be closer to home, so raised a family here. I had plenty of opportunities to go elsewhere. As a matter of fact, during the air traffic controller strike, I went back to New York for a while. And then I went to Allentown for a while, because Allentown had lost most of its controllers. And then I went back to New York and worked at Kennedy again for a period of time. And in 1995, I took a job at Lancaster Tower as the manager. And in '99, the FAA had been contracting out a lot of their towers that had lower capacities. And so a contractor took over the control tower, the Lancaster Tower, and those controllers right there now work for a contractor. And so I had to leave there and go somewhere else. I had a young child in the area, so I just wanted to go back to Harrisburg. I went back to Harrisburg in '99, and I was working the day of the 9/11 when that whole thing happened. And a few years later, I asked the manager, a guy named Glenn Brumel, some of you might know him, he passed away about a year ago. And I said, Glenn, look, I'm tired of working in the office here. How about I just go back to the control room floor and take my job back again and work Sundays and holidays and nights and midnights? And he said, that'd be great, Mark, because he must have talked to me at that point. Anyway, he couldn't wait to get rid of me, so I was back in the town. So I finished my career there in May of '04, started my own business where I tried to help pilots in the local area learn how to operate the air traffic control system, because private pilots somehow are a little intimidated by talking to a controller. They're afraid of making a mistake, and they can. And so they sometimes decide they're not going to talk to anybody. They're going to go to places where controllers don't have to talk to anybody. And so I thought that I would create this course where I could explain to pilots how to fly in the air traffic system. And that lasted for a while until I ran out of money, because the FAA wouldn't advertise it, because I was actually charging an admission to mine where there were other seminars that were available that were for free. And so the FAA went from the beginning advertising my course to no longer advertising it. So I had to get out of that business, and as fate would have it, the FAA decided to contract out a lot of their training. So I was hired as an instructor to train both new and existing controllers at the Harrisburg Tower on new policies, new equipment, and also new people that came into the facility to give them classroom information as to how to get qualified to become a controller there. Because everybody has to, every time you go to a different location, you have to certify. So I've been doing that since 2007. And I'm still doing it today, not as much as I was before, but that is really the extent of my career. And so that, from the time I worked my first airplane in 1964, here we were in 2007 when I finally, I'm really still involved in the business. I love the business so much. I respect it so much. I respect the people that do this job. Preventing airplanes from crashing into one another is really the primary responsibility of air traffic controllers. When a controller you ask a controller, what's your primary responsibility, they seldom say that, because that's not, they just don't think about that. What they think about is the safe, orderly, expeditious handling of air traffic. And it has been working very well for many, many years, and it still works today. As I say, when I controlled my first airplane in '64, the system was exactly the same. Now with GPS systems, where a controller had to actually give a pilot a heading to get from one place to another, now you can really tell the pilot to go direct, and the pilot can go direct to that position. Of course, they've always had these flight directors in their airplanes where they could go direct any place anyway just by turning a knob. I don't know if there's any airline pilots here, but once they get airborne and a controller says, proceed on course, they pretty much can sit back and watch the airplane fly itself all the way through it. So including these days, landing itself. So air traffic control is a first come, first served basis. Air traffic controllers, there are lots of different jobs that air traffic controllers can participate in, most of which I have done. There are are the centers. The centers are the people who control traffic pretty much in between airports and at higher altitudes. There's a tower, such as Lancaster Tower. Those people in that tower are VFR controllers, VFR being visual flight rules. They're the ones who pretty much right around the airport say clear to land, clear for takeoff, clear for taxi. No controller, no pilot rather, can enter any part of an airport or anything that is controlled by air traffic without getting approval to do so. Even going from the ramp area to the taxiway. If you're at Lancaster Airport, which is a controlled airport, you have to get permission to do that. If you're at Smoketown Airport, where it's uncontrolled, you can go anywhere you want. If people would, you wonder how an airplanes can, how they land and take off by themselves at airports that are uncontrolled, they do that by working it out with one another. Lancaster Tower, when it closes at 11 at night, when Lancaster Tower closes at 11 at night, anybody that's coming into land there, if there's more than one or more than two or three, those pilots work it out between one another on who's going to land first and who's going to land second and who's going to take off when and what. So, and that works very safely. It's worked pretty darn well all these years. Then there is a facility like Harrisburg, which has both a tower and a radar room. So those controllers actually have to do both. Another example of that would be Philadelphia to a larger scale, Pittsburgh a larger scale. Both those, and Allentown, again. These are airports that controllers work in the tower and work down in the radar room. Totally two different aptitudes. I mean, I've seen controllers who were terrific in the tower, but really stunk when it came to vectoring airplanes and keeping them separated on the radar. And honestly, it really is like a game, which I'm lousy at computer games, but when it came to vectoring airplanes, controlling them on radar, man, I found out I could really do well. And I must say that every day that I went to work for my entire career, I couldn't wait to get there. When I was a controller at Kennedy, actually, I went, during the evening shifts, I went to work an hour early because I wanted to get the hottest position in the place, the one that would have the most airplanes. And so I went an hour early. Then the FAA, a few years later, found out that they had to pay all of us who signed in an hour early for overtime. So they quickly stopped that. They quickly stopped. Somebody complained they had been going in an hour early. That this was the PATCO union back then. That was the union that actually struck in 1981. And there's a lot, I'm very well aware of everything that happened there because I was on the ground floor at the beginning of that union, even in Cleveland when I heard F. Bailey speak for the first time, and he was the first executive director of PATCO. So I was there when the strike came about. Thank goodness I was already in management. I didn't have to make that decision. Otherwise, I mean, who knows? I mean, if you were in some places, it took a lot more to go to work than it did not to go to work. And of course, those controllers who thought that, who were told by the union that they can't fire all of you, quickly found out that that wasn't true. And so there's a great story about that. I think that it was the Department of Transportation head at that time, Drew Lewis, I think, was a Pennsylvanian, who went and negotiated with PATCO and struck a deal with the PATCO executive director at the time, a guy named Bob Polai, and they shook hands on a deal. And the controllers actually were going to get some money, which is more than any federal union had ever done, negotiate with the federal government for money. And when Polai took it back to the rank and file, they turned it down. And so when Drew Lewis had to go back to Reagan with the information that, hey, listen, there's no deal. That's when Reagan decided to fire everyone, and that was it. He wasn't about to change his mind. He had to come back within, I think, 3 days. So that's what air traffic controllers do. How does an airplane get from one place to another? They usually do it by radio stations that are on the ground. If you would drive by Lancaster Airport, there's that kind of upside down red and white bowling pin that sits there. Is that still there?
No, it's shorter.
It's shorter now. You can't see it from the road anymore, right? And this was what was known as a VHF omnidirectional range. And through a series of these ranges all across the country, they built highways in the sky. And they still have these. They have disabled many of them because they don't need them as much anymore, and I think that eventually they'll do away with them entirely. But that's how aircraft navigated then, and that's how they navigate today. By tuning in the frequency of one of those radio stations, going to another radio station. When you're about halfway there, you tune in the next frequency, and you pick up the other radio station, and that's how you flew on highways back and forth across the country. And controllers use those highways and mileage from them to provide separation. Controllers can actually do a pretty darn good job on separating airplanes without using radar. And they did it for many years before we started using radar, which we've been using radar since World War II. And I think, matter of fact, when the Japanese were invading Pearl Harbor, I think they looked at that radar and didn't believe that was really a fleet of Japanese airplanes coming in. That was a successful use of radar, except they didn't believe it. So where's the air traffic system going from here? It's ever evolving. It's slow to evolve, but we're in an era right now where it's evolving pretty quickly, more quickly than it ever has before. In 2020, pardon me, all pilots will have to have in their airplanes, if they're going into certain airspace, equipment that allows other airplanes to see them on a piece of equipment that they have in their airplane. In other words, they'll have a little scope, they'll have kind of, akin to a radar scope, and they will see other airplanes that are around them on that scope. And you will not be able to fly into certain airspace unless you have that equipment. And then in 2025, I believe, you'll have to have equipment that not only allows you to see other airplanes to see you, but allows you to see other airplanes. So eventually where we're going is total computerized operation of air traffic control. And they'll be using controllers to monitor the system as opposed to actually telling pilots where to go. Which is what a lot of controllers want to tell pilots exactly where to go. So that's where the system is going. As far as privatization is concerned, I don't think it's a bad idea. With the FAA, when you have FAA being a government entity, when they go to Congress every year with a request for money, Congress usually says to them, "Oh, isn't this the best air traffic control system in the world?" The answer is yes. Isn't it the safest air traffic control system in the world? The answer is yes. That being the case, if it's the best and the safest, why should we give you any more money to make it better and safer? And so they struggle every year with getting money from Congress to operate the system. As far as privatizing it, I think it's a Pennsylvania Representative Schuster that introduced the bill in the House. I think it's out of the House now. I think it's pretty cool as to how other representatives feel about this bill. As far as the Senate is concerned, last year they did in the continuing resolution did not give the FAA, did not talk about privatization. They just increased the FAA's funding by about $500 million, I think. And so that's where it is. Is it a bad idea to privatize? I think not. Will it happen anytime soon? It looks like that's not going to be the case either. So that's air traffic control. It's people always ask, is it a demanding job? It is a demanding job. Is it a stressful job? And for me, and for lots of people that I know, it was the stress that was the charm of the job. It's like when you're playing, if you thought you were a good baseball player, you play shortstop, you wanted everybody to hit it to you. Well, it's the same with controllers who really think they can do the job well. They want to work the busiest position. They really want the challenges. And so for me, it was never stressful. It was an accomplishment every time I went to work. The sweet part about the job before I went into management, and at the end when I was no longer in management, is that you put your headset on every day. And at the end of the day, you take it off, you hang it up, you come back in the next day, start all over again. You don't take anything home with you. The only time I ever remember dreaming about airplanes, I think I was in training at Kennedy, and it was a Christmas Eve. And there were so many airplanes that came at me that I was in training. And so the person that was monitoring me, when you're in training, until you're certified, somebody's plugged in with you and listening to everything you say. That's a really difficult part about air traffic control, is becoming a certified controller. because everything you say until that time is being listened to, and somebody's critiquing it because they write a training form out every time you get off the position. And so that night, I thought I did a really great job because there were so many airplanes, we actually had to go into a hole. Don't do that too much anymore. Back in the day, as the kids say then, as the kids say now, we're talking about the 70s, when there were too many airplanes coming into that the runway couldn't handle all those airplanes, you stopped and you went into a hole. And airplanes just circled around, and we stacked them 1,000 feet above each other, and you put them in a holding pattern. And then the supervisor would come over and say, okay, see these airplanes going in? That's your last guy. You take all your guys off the stack and you follow that. And that was so much fun because you had a big glob of airplanes in a holding pattern, and 10 minutes later, all your airplanes that were in there were one behind another, 5 or 6 miles, following these guys into the runway. It was so much fun. It was so much fun. Pilots didn't always think that. I worked one time, there was a Northwest Airlines pilot, there was a 727, I think, in the holding pattern. And he had been there for like 2 hours. And he said, look, we have to go refuel. So we had to take him out of the holding pattern, and I think he went to Minneapolis at that time to refuel. And about 4 hours later, I was working that same guy back in the same holding pattern. They held again for an hour or so. So nowadays, what they try to do, we have this big command center in Washington, and they try to get the traffic to flow in such a way that if there are delays, you'll take that delay on the ground, as opposed to somewhere in the air having to hold. Now, depending on what pilots you talk to, lots of guys, would just rather be in the air. I think they get paid more to be in the air than they do at the gate anyway. And but nowadays, for the passengers, certainly, unless they taxied out and they're sitting on the tarmac, if they're in the terminal, fine. But sometimes they'll taxi out, and all of a sudden there'll be a delay, and you'll be taxiing out for a departure, and suddenly the captain says, "Listen, got a little bit of delay going into Charlotte. We're going to have to hold out here for a while." And depending on what they determine as far as the acceptance rate is, that's how long you have to probably stay out there on the taxiway and hold. Now, there are rules now that they've put into effect that if you have to sit out there for more than 2 hours, I think it is, on a domestic flight, the airline pays a fine after that for every, I don't know if it's a minute or if it's 5 minutes, but they start paying fine. And so they do whatever they can to either get going, and the controllers always want to get you going. They don't want to space. It's not in their best interest to delay you. They want to keep going. And the biggest reason for the delays, honestly, is weather. When I say weather, I mean thunderstorms. Two conditions where weather caused delays. The biggest is thunderstorms, because when airplanes have to deviate around them, because they won't go through them. They will not go through them. When they have to deviate around them, that means that you're going to have to, you as a controller, have to take that airplane into somebody else's airspace. And controllers are all responsible for their own airspace. And for you to get permission to go into somebody else's airspace, they have to approve it. And so they might approve 1 or 2 of the people you're working, but then when they get to 3 and 4, they're also busy moving airplanes around their airspace, and they have to say, listen, you can't take any more. I can't take any more of your airplanes. So then you call the controller that handing off to you and say, listen, don't give me any more airplanes. And he says to the next controller, don't give me any more airplanes. And eventually, everything backs up. Now we start holding on the ground. That's one basic reason for delays. The line of thunderstorms can be pretty long. Pilots will go as far as they can to get around them if they're not lucky enough to get through. And so that's the basic reason for delays. So summertime, big delays. The other time that there are delays is when airports are fogged in, because every approach that a pilot can make into an airport has an altitude at which you cannot go below it. In other words, if the pilot doesn't see the airport at that altitude, he has to pull up and go around. So that's another reason for delays. Once weather gets down low enough, pilots decide, well, we're not even going to try this approach. Let's hold down here for a little bit, see if the weather gets better. And once they start doing that, then delays begin to back up. Those are the 2 main reasons for delays. Other than computer outages, which we had a couple of weeks ago in Atlanta, that happens occasionally. So also pilots, lots of pilots use the system. There are lots of VFR pilots, especially pilots in training, which a place like Lancaster Airport has lots of pilots that are flying in and out of their training, having to do mandatory flights in order to get their pilot's license. But so you deal with inexperience as controllers. And working at Kennedy, you deal with pilots from all over the world. They all speak English because if you're a signatory to the international agreement, ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, I guess. By agreement, everybody speaks English. So wherever you're flying, if you're flying into an international airport, you're going to speak English to the air traffic controllers. And then you work people, as I say, who don't have much experience. Excuse me, I know I worked an airplane once on Long Island, where a woman was calling for traffic advisors. She was flying around privately, and she just wanted to ask me as a controller to point out other airplanes that were in her vicinity. And she came over and says, Kennedy approach Cessna 42567, we're over Long Island. So I just for some reason, I just wanted to play around, and I said, well, are you over Brooklyn or Montauk Point? And she said, we're right along the shore. I said, thanks, that narrowed it down. I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fun stories. I mentioned a story before, there was an Eastern Airlines pilot made. Boy, there's a blast from the past as far as an airline is concerned. We've lost so many of them. Who took off and didn't like the heading I gave him. He was going to somewhere. I think he was going to Miami. And he said, how do you expect me to get there with that heading? And I said, well, look, Captain, just go to the first ocean and make a right. He figured that out. So lots of great stories, most of them from New York. The funny story from Harrisburg is when we had a new communication system that was put in, and they wanted to use the room that had been used for it to turn it into an office. And as they were doing so, they had like a junction box up here, and somebody asked one of the technicians, do they still use a junction box? He said no. So they hacksawed through it to put a ceiling in, and 10 days later we got our radar back and all of our frequencies, because we had just lost everything. Just lucky. Anyway, it's a terrific job. FAA, see, every now and then they hire. If you know young people, you have to be hired before your 31st birthday. There's no real requirement. Really, there's no, one of the requirements is to have a degree, but you don't have to have a degree. You can have experience as a pilot, you can have experience in the military, and lots of ways that you can qualify to become an air traffic controller. I would suggest it, if someone has the temperament for it and the aptitude, that you encourage people to go on the FAA website, FAA.gov, and apply for a position, because it's very, very rewarding. Thank you for having me, and I'll take some questions if I may.